It is with great pride that I can announce I've found a new hobby. Not one that's meaningful or productive, mind you. That would simply be too much to ask from me. My new thing is crawling the depths of Dungeons & Dragons related subreddits, looking for people asking for unsolicited advice from internet strangers such as myself. I do this for two reasons. One, I absolutely love reading horror stories about shitty, awful, no good, very bad Dungeons & Dragons tables. And two, 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons is probably the one field I could call a field of expertise that I have, which is incredibly sad for me personally. I mean, we've all got to be good at something, right? My thing is playing pretend and being a wizard, so come with me, my friends, as we take a trip through the depths of reddit.org and provide some help to the people who need it most. Tabletop gamers who are having a rough time. God, I need a fucking haircut. This first cry for help comes from Reddit user Pat1487 and is titled, DM ruled that featherfall can't be used unless you fall from 500 feet or higher. You know a bad DM story is going to be great when they start off with just an oddly specific number. Our group is playing Out of the Abyss. We are level 9, and I am a barbarian/fighter, while the other players are a rogue, bard, wizard, and druid. We find ourselves in a labyrinth and encountered a 30-foot tall obsidian tower. We get up to the door and the rogue checks it for traps and tries to lockpick it, finding nothing and is told that the door has no lock. I try to brute force the door open, but I cannot, for I rolled a 13. The wizard does an arcana check, rolling a 19, and is told that there is magic here, but doesn't learn of a way to open the door. It turns out the DM specifically wanted us to use Identify on the door to be able to figure out how to open it, but nobody has that spell. So the druid turns into a hawk and flies up to the top of the tower with one end of a rope in his mouth and ties it off up there so we can all just climb the tower. We get to the top and fight 4 gargoyles on the roof, and after the fight we find a trap door of the roof with a latch, which again the rogue and wizard tried to do their thing, but find no way to open it. The bard also tried an arcana check, but both the wizard and the bard were told the same thing. Everything below you is magic. The wizard decides to use Dispel Magic on the trapdoor, hoping to dispel whatever was on the door. We all joked about how dispelling the magic affecting the whole tower could leave us falling, and that's exactly what the DM said happened. The whole tower turned into a small obsidian cube and caused us all to fall. The bard tried to cast Featherfall for the first time in the campaign, and the DM ruled that there wasn't enough time to cast it since we would fall 30 feet to the ground in about a second, and that casting a spell takes 6 seconds, and that you'd have to cast it ahead of time or fall from 500 feet. I tried to explain reactions to him and that you can't even cast it ahead of time since it has a casting time of 1 reaction, but he wouldn't hear it. And after a bit of arguing, just said, DM ruling, and we all took 10 damage from the fall instead of rolling fall damage. Oh boy. So far, that's the cruelest thing here, I think. I mean, you don't even give them the good grace to roll fall damage. Like, that's just... come on. So first of all, our friendly neighborhood barbarian and fighter is absolutely correct. Like, you know, a reaction doesn't take a full round to cast. It's just like fucking that. I will say, though, just devil's advocate here. I mean, there is some avenue that the DM could technically be in the right here. If one wanted to, one could argue that the sudden collapsing of the tower would leave the party on top of it quite surprised. Surprised, of course, being a condition in 5th edition D&D, which prevents you from taking actions or reactions until you stop being surprised. If the ground beneath me suddenly disappeared, like, right this second and left me with a 30-foot drop, I don't think I would start screaming until I hit the ground. Like, that's just me, quite honestly. That being said, this guy's just a dick. Like, we can't really get past that. There's a lot to unpack in this particular story. Like, rolling a 19 on an Arcana check is not an easy thing to do. Like, you should really get more from that roll rather than just, everything is made of magic. The wizard rolled a 19 on an Arcana check and didn't get shit from that. Like, that fucking sucks, honestly. Like, for something to have a DC of 20 or higher, like, you need to be very good at what you are trying to do in order to interact with that thing. Like, a door that requires a DC 20 strength check to open is like, this fucking thing is made of stone or metal, and you literally need to be stronger than 90% of the humans who exist in the world today in order to open this thing. Rolling a 20 on an Arcana check is like, you are an intellectual prodigy, and you know a lot of shit about fucking everything. Couple that with the fact that it is very hard to get good Arcana in 5th edition D&D because there are only 2 classes that prioritize intelligence as a mainline attribute. Those classes, of course, being the Wizard and the Artificer, and I guess you could argue that Rogues are intended to be played with high intelligence, but nobody fucking does. Let's be real. The proficiency they get in intelligence saving throws is just like, that stops 1 person from getting feeble-minded every year. That's it. So on a high Arcana roll, like, you really have to be, like, rewarded with something, I think. Even if you can't immediately tell, like, all of the deep background lore of this ancient tower or something, like, for a roll that high, you really should have some manner of path forward. Like, at the very least, a 19 Arcana roll should get you the only way to understand this thing is to cast Identify on it. Which is bullshit, again, but at least, they should have at least gotten that. Also, any puzzle that, like, forces you to use, like, one particular spell and one particular spell alone is, like, come on. Like, at least make sure the party has the means to cast that spell at the very least. Like, come on. Like, what do you mean he wanted you to cast the Identify spell? Like, if no one can cast that, no one can cast that. Like, if that's the only way to solve that problem, you should have at least given the wizard a fucking spell scroll of Identify earlier in the campaign so he could inscribe it into his spell book or at least use it once. Like, Identify is just, I cast a 1st level spell to automatically succeed on an Arcana check. Like, that's... read between the lines of the spell description. Like, that's what that is. Also, there is no doubt in my mind that the only reason the tower disappeared underneath these adventurers is because they joked about it. Like, literally, they say we all joked about how dispelling the magical effect would cause the whole tower beneath us to crumble, and then, like, the fact that that immediately happened, like, that tells me that the DM had no idea what was coming out of this encounter, and he was like, oh, thank fuck, I have something to do here. And, okay, let's say you did want to play the surprise condition card and say that, like, yeah, the entire tower collapsed beneath you, you're surprised, you can't take actions or reactions, you fall and hit the ground and take some damage and are unable to cast Featherfall. That sucks. That is a choice for a very particular kind of campaign, I think. Like, to me, that's one of those kind of dungeon delving traps that it's like, oh, you didn't roll high enough to see this trap, like, immediate damage. Like, unavoidable, fuck you, get poisoned, stunned, paralyzed, crit on, idiot. Which, like, there is a context for that. Like, if you wanted to run, like, a very old school, like, dungeon delving kind of experience where it's like, hey, this is highly lethal, highly dangerous. Like, if you don't roll high enough, you will just run face first into a trap and just get fucked. Like, that is a thing that people can do. That is a game that appeals to some people. The problem is, if that's the kind of game you want to play, you should sort that out fucking ahead of time. So yeah, you should absolutely be able to use Featherfall without having to fall 500 feet. Like, where does the 500 feet... Hold on, where does the 500 feet even come from? Like, is there any fucking math for that? 500 feet is also a really long time to fall. Like, I think that maxes you out on fall damage. Actually, let me check that because I don't want to be... I don't want to be wrong on the internet because people will eat me alive. Yeah, at the end of a fall, you take 1d6 bludgeoning damage for every 10 feet that you fell to a maximum of 20d6. So falling 200 feet would max out your fall damage. If you have to fall 500 feet in order to have Featherfall work, you have to fall more than twice terminal velocity. This spell, the way this DM puts it, is literally only useful if you and the gang want to go skydiving. Ridiculous. Dungeon Master in the wrong. Player in the right. Confirmed. Our next story comes to us from Reddit user Mission Responsible 802. My table feels stupidly imbalanced and everyone but me is fine with it. We're at a table of 6 level 9 players, a Blood Hunter, Warlock, Sorcerer, Monk, Artificer, and Barbarian. The Blood Hunter decided he would ignore his advantage restrictions about hunting monsters and has advantage on Investigation, Perception, and Insight permanently. The Sorcerer gets 7 Scorching Blasts that deal 3d6 apiece, up to 21d6 damage if they hit. The Artificer just has a straight up modern gun that does 30 damage minimum. The Monk, stuck in the same boat I am, can hit 8 times but only does 1d6 per strike. And I, the Warlock, deal 2 instances of 1d10 damage depending if my Eldritch Blast works. or my 2 spell slots that I almost have to use on counterspell because the rest of the party is suicidal. That's not to mention our 2 DMPCs, level 14 and 16 respectively, multiple 20s in different stats, sweeping every encounter because if they weren't present, we'd literally just die. They don't just heal us, they don't just get us out of bad spots, they do everything for us. I'm the only person at the table who has a problem with these things because I feel so weak despite being the same level as a bunch of others. My ideas are looked over because my character does less for the party and just uses spare the dying, and I don't know how to deal with it. Oh boy. Okay, there is a lot to unpack here. First of which is figuring out what the fuck a blood hunter is. Matthew Mercer? Alright, so I'm not going to touch that. But yeah, there is a lot of busted shit here. I'm not entirely sure what this person means by saying their sorcerer gets 7 Scorching Blasts that deal 3d6 apiece. I can only assume that's some modified high-level Scorching Ray kind of ability. But even then, 1 bolt from Scorching Ray is supposed to be 2d6, so that's like already buffed then and there. So that clearly reads to me as a homebrew item, and I think one of the things people don't keep in mind with a lot of the homebrew that they make is keeping things in line with the precedent of the game. Like, to me, good homebrew builds upon the mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons without, you know, superseding or making any of the existing mechanics irrelevant. Like, if this is what I think, and it's just like a modified Scorching Ray that supersedes the spell that already exists, like, there's no reason to cast Scorching Ray. You can just Scorching Blast. The Artificer just having a gun is very funny to me. Like, guns in D&D have always been, like, the running question. Like, should you have guns in D&D? Like, how do they fit into the world? Like, all of that jazz, right? But no matter where you fall on the gun debate in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, I think we can all agree that 30 damage minimum might be a little bit too high for a martial weapon. I mean, looking at the table for modern firearms in the Dungeon Master's Guide, like, a Glock, an automatic pistol, should only be doing about 2d6 piercing damage. If you want to get a little bit more beefy, a revolver should do about 2d8. Like, it sounds like this Artificer doesn't just have a modern day gun, he's got a fucking antimatter rifle. And look, I don't want to step on anybody's fun, right? Like, there's campaigns that we play where you just get stupidly overpowered or get stupid magic weapons, and that's like the fun of it, right? Sometimes that's just the vibe, and that vibe can be good. But it seems like some people just aren't being included in this vibe, which is a problem. Like, if somebody's gonna get a 30 damage gun, like, everybody should at least get something, right? Like, give the monk fucking, like, electrified brass knuckles or something. Like, if you're gonna say who gives a shit, then do not, by any stretch of the imagination, give a shit. I will say, though, the guy who wrote this post is kind of playing a warlock. So, I mean, if you want to complain about being underpowered, maybe don't play a warlock. I mean, I'm mostly being facetious with that. I think that warlocks are in a bad spot right now. Like, I know so many people who have played mainline warlocks in 5th edition D&D who just didn't really have a fun time. And like, I think a lot of that comes down to how we as a collective society have just chosen to play D&D over the last couple of years. Like, at least in my experience, a lot of the games that I've either run or played have been a lot more like, you know, cinematic affairs. Like, it is very clear that a lot of people playing D&D today got into it through things like Critical Role, The Adventure Zone, Not Another D&D Podcast, Dimension 20, all of which have very, you know, narrative-focused, live play, entertainment, story kind of structures. There's lore, there's big battles, but it's also very episodic, for lack of a better term. And the by-the-book rules in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons are not quite set up for that 100% of the time. Like, the poster here is complaining about only getting 2 spell slots as a warlock, which, you're right, that's not many resources to play with. But those spell slots also get restored on a short rest, and they're also very high level by default, which gets a little bit more balanced when you consider that the by-the-book Dungeon Master's Guide ruling says that parties should be encountering about 5 to 8 medium or hard encounters before finally being able to sit down and have a good long sleep. That is an adventuring style that gives you probably a lot more short rests, which then gives the Warlock much more spells to play with. But I also think that's just not a system that many people use when they're playing D&D these days. Like, I think in my half decade or so of playing this game, I think I've had like 4 short rests. And only like 2 of them actually followed proper short rest rules. The other 2 were just like, oh yeah, we're starting a session from a week ago. Fucking sure, you can have a short rest. Like, fucking why not? I mean, despite all that, the fact that this Warlock has to continually use their 2 spell slots on counterspell is like, that fucking sucks. Warlocks get so few spells to play with. To be locked to 2 spell slots, and to be further locked to only 1 spell, like, this Warlock is not wrong about anything. Like, I know the meme for Warlocks is just Eldritch Blast, Eldritch Blast, Eldritch Blast, but outside of that, it's fun to finally be able to use one of your very limited spell slots in order to, you know, do a big cool thing. Like, at this level, that Warlock has 2 5th level spell slots. That is literally double the 5th level spell slots that any other spellcaster has. And if you factor in 2 short rests into a day of adventuring, they can cast those 5th level spells 6 times more than an average spellcaster. But to literally just be siloed into only using it for counterspell, like, just stop. Just don't do it. Like, they're fucking running in and being suicidal with their Scorching Ray staff and their fucking plasma pistol. Okay. Do it. Dungeons & Dragons is a game of action and consequence. They chose their action. They sit with the consequence. I mean, I say that, but they've already, like, set the precedent for using counterspell on their party in this way, so, like, yeah, to suddenly not do that now, like, there's no way that can't be personal. Honestly, I think the icing on the cake here is also the 2 DM PCs. Like, I understand that a dungeon master, like, you know, wants to play Dungeons and Dragons, but to put 2 NPCs in the party that are higher level than the rest of the party, like, that's just, come on. What are you doing? Like, as a DM, your enjoyment shouldn't be having a power trip in the fantasy world of the Forgotten Realms. Your enjoyment should be filling the friends that you have around the table with excitement, fear, greed, or lust. Or all 4, if you choose. As a dungeon master, it is your job to balance the adventure around the party. Like, shoving 2 demigods into the pack, that's not balancing. That's fucking tipping the scales of the cosmos. And look, I'm, you know, joking around and having a good time here, but if this Warlock is actually, you know, having their ideas be overlooked and, like, getting less attention at the table simply because they're not as busted as the rest of the party, who are busted for homebrew things that are allowed by the Dungeon Master, mind you, like, that just fucking sucks, man. Like, if I myself was in this position, I would really have a think about whether or not I would want to continue playing at that table. Like, to have all of these other characters get all this busted shit provided to them by the Dungeon Master while you get nothing, and, you know, I'm making it known that you're not really having a good time, like come on, there's no way that can't suck. I'm sorry, Mission Response 802, a person whose name I definitely got wrong when I opened this, like, I hope you find a new table. I hope you find a better table. I hope you find friends who value and enjoy your company. Because you know what? You seem like a chill person. Because you would knowingly play a Warlock in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Is that mean? I don't want it to be mean. I love you, Warlock mains. This next post comes to us from Reddit user Force Rounds. Was I being too strict? Player quits session 0 because I denied a lore problematic race. I feel like the sentence lore problematic race would activate my fight or flight response in any other context outside of Dungeons & Dragons. A friend I met recently joined us last second for my session 0 of Minds of Phandelver. I'm a new DM trying it out with mostly new players too. Even in 2024, they've got a bit of a Sans Undertale obsession, and they wanted to play a skeleton. The other players were mostly cool with it. A couple groaned because they knew they wanted to play it for the meme, but I agreed to let them play a skeleton as long as they covered up their appearance in towns and interacting with story NPCs. I said it would cause issues in the setting and people would be afraid of the skeleton. Understandably. They played the skeleton character in Divinity Original Sin 2, so I thought they'd understand. I also gave the option of swapping some of the races of the common enemy fodder and Big Bad to skeletons so that they could play a recurring villain. All I got back from them was, why can't you just be fun? And they dropped. I mean, at the end of the day, like, Session 0, like, that's probably the best time to drop out of something you don't want to be a part of. Like, you know what I mean? One of the biggest things that I enjoy about Dungeons & Dragons is that you can have so many experiences with it. Like, you can have the rich, lore-dense, open-world adventure with kingdoms and noble hierarchies and, like, you know, history spanning 10,000s of years, or you can just be a bunch of fantasy college dropouts, like kicking teeth in and shooting fireballs in a crowded bar because that's a fun thing to do on a Sunday afternoon. And the beauty of D&D is that you can do all of that. Like, those are all very valid and real experiences to have with the game. What I think it really comes down to 90% of the time is, what kind of experience do you want to have? It sounds to me like this DM is trying to have that more, you know, lore-heavy, world-building kind of game, which, again, like, they're allowed to want that. But then you have the clear disconnect with the person who, you know, wants to be a funny little skeleton and play a funny little trombone. Dude. Like, these people are right to have the opinions that they have and to want the things that they want. I would say that probably the best way to have gone about this would not be to say, hey, you know, this is 100% what's going to happen to your player in this world that we're currently running, and more to phrase it as a question and be like, okay, what do you want to get out of this experience? When you say you want to be a skeleton, do you mean you want to play your ribs like a xylophone, rolling a performance check to create a distraction while everybody else loots the tavern goers blind? Or do you want to have the really lore-rich Divinity Original Sin 2 racist skeleton man experience? It's been a very long time since I played Divinity Original Sin 2. Was the skeleton racist? He, like, hated humans, didn't he? Like, that was his whole thing. Was the Divinity Skeleton man racist? Oh shit. Like, there are pros and cons to both kind of game, right? Having a gruesome visage that will literally make the townsfolk run in fear of you, like, that's a very hard thing to work around, but that could also be a very fun part of the experience if you have the tools to, you know, get around that with. Maybe you have the Mask of Many Faces invocation from the Warlock class. Maybe you have Disguise Self, which is more or less the same thing that I said before, but I think this time it takes a spell slot. But it also could be a very mechanical disadvantage that locks the player out of doing a lot of stuff in the game if that is the kind of game that you wanted to run. And I think that's one of the things that people really need to keep in mind when they're running these games as a DM. Like, sure, you're building the lore, you're building the world, you're building the story, but you're also building a game as well. If you think about skeletons being a horrifying thing to experience as a game mechanic, would that mechanic lock this player out of a lot of experiences from the game? And alternatively, do they have the tools to work around that mechanic while still having a fun time? Like, I can very easily see a situation in this instance where it's like, okay, everyone's going into the palace to, you know, network with the nobles at this fancy ball for story reasons. Well, I'm kind of a skeleton man, so because I can't really be seen by public eyes, I should just wait in the stables, I guess. And that's the kind of thing that you want to avoid as a dungeon master. Like, you can't just put that restriction on your players and then expect them to be like, well, okay, deal with it. I mean, you can just say that they can deal with it, but you have to have a lot of lenience with the solutions that you're willing to accept just to make sure that they can still remain playing at the table. Alternatively, other way you can go about it, oh, there's a skeleton man over there walking through the streets. Dragons exist. This isn't the weirdest thing that could possibly happen today. Let's be real, when you live in a world where a sexy squid man can come out of a hole in space and subjugate an entire populace of a city to also become sexy squid men, like, you gotta have a lot of leniency with what you're willing to put up in your day-to-day life when that's just a thing that has a non-zero chance of happening. Oh, it's in the lore. It would be weird. Like, the fucking Gith are from the space dimension. And they were just chilling around in the Dungeons & Dragons movie. Like, they're just fucking there. Number one advice to any Dungeon Master that I would probably give is just make sure your expectations are known, both from your perspective and the players. If you want to run a rich, lore-heavy experience, or if you want to run a really brutally hard, like, high lethality dungeon crawl, like, the people you're running this game for should know that ahead of time. And if they don't want to play the game you want to run, and if you don't want to run the kind of game that they want to play, that's fine. Like, that's okay. There are people out there who want to run those kinds of games, and there are people out there who want to play in those kinds of games, whatever those games may be. But because there is so many possibilities with what can happen in the game of D&D, like, you just gotta be on the same page about it. Like, that's all it boils down to. So was this DM being too strict? I don't think so. I think their higher priority should have just been making sure everybody was on the same page vis-a-vis expectations, rather than going, okay, here's the lore, here's the mechanics, here is what will happen, you know, if you do that. And it's a session 0. This is where you figure out the answers to those kinds of questions. And if the answer that any of those people involved are looking for is, I don't want to play this game. But at the end of the day, the number one thing to remember is that my opinion doesn't matter for shit. The only thing that matters is what you, the loyal viewer, thinks. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Let me know in the comments below. Do you think I'm a fucking idiot without style nor grace who shouldn't be left alive and wandering this planet? Let me know. Your opinion matters more to me than my own, than my partner's, than my family's. Like, you, as far as I'm concerned, are the most important person in the universe. Because you are here with me in this moment. And I think that's pretty special. So anyway, let me know in the comments what you think. Like and subscribe, do all that shit, and... yeah. Oh, I love Dungeons & Dragons. I'd love to play it someday.